Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fertile Ground with Mike and Coach. My name is Mike Cornell, and I'm alongside Coach Ron Lathey. When was the last time you heard Psalm 23 read? Was it a funeral? What context really was it in? Was it in a context of being content for life, which a lot of people normally don't associate that? And what does the Bible have to say about it? This is all going to be front and center today, Coach, as we take a look at Psalm 23 in today's text. And as we get started, we have three things we would like for you to think about and to consider. And the first one is this: how does the Lord provide for our needs in contentment? And this is a really good spot for your note taker to grab a pen, grab a piece of paper, grab your Bible, and follow right along with us here today. Second of all, is it easier for us to follow God in times of goodness or hardship? Something to really think about there, Coach. And then finally, how should the promise of heaven change the way we handle and look at hardships on earth? And today we continue with the International Sunday School series that we follow from week to week. And Coach, here we go. Last week, the title of our study was Trust in God Alone. And we were actually in Psalm 62. This week, the title of our study is Confidence in God's Shepherding. And we're in Psalm 23, a very, very familiar passage to many, many people, Coach. And could you just kind of set the stage as we get started here today?
Yeah, sure. You know, the 23rd Psalm is one that people, as you mentioned, hear a lot. And one of the things that it seems to try to bring out is a couple things, but especially the idea of contentment, being content and letting God, which follows up what we started last week in our lesson, and letting God have control. And I ran across a story that I like to summarize about Psalm 23. There was once a Shakespearean actor who, every time he finished his acting, whatever it was, he just went out on stage and recited poetry and did different things. But his last event was always he would recite Psalm 23. And whenever he did, when he got finished, people would just applaud and how well he could do that and reach them as he was just quoting the psalm. One night when he was finished up, there was a young man on the front row that actually asked him if he could present Psalm 23 at the end. And the actor was kind of taken aback. He's thinking, what's this guy after? He can't do it as good as I can do it, And so he just said, well, I'll give this upstart a chance and see what happens. So the young man came up and the actor says, go ahead. And so he started reciting Psalm 23. And when he recited the psalm, at the end, there was no applause. There was no anything really. And but you could hear people in the back, they were weeping, and the actor thought and said to the young man, he said, I've done this all my life and I've never had a reaction like this. And he said, how do you explain this? And the young man looked at him and said, well, sir, he said, you know the psalm, but I know the shepherd.
That's really good.
And I thought that was a pretty good way to kind of sum up Psalm 23 in the many places it's used.
Well, it really is, and that's a great story to kind of open up our discussion here today, Coach. And we know that David is obviously the author here, and once again, we really aren't sure of the season that David's in his life. But when you look at this, David spiritually is wrapped up pretty tight. I mean, he's in a really, really sound camp as this begins, and we see him in a season of contentment. And he had many seasons in his life, and I'm sure it took many seasons for him to get to this season of contentment that he has that we see here in Psalm 23.
Yeah, the place he's in, just to recap real quickly from last week, David just came out and said over and over again that he said, God is my rock, he's my refuge, he's my protector, he's my fortress, he's my hope, he's my rest, and he's my salvation. And I mean, he was that, just walking with God as close probably as any person ever did.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started here with Psalm 23. And here we see in the first 4 verses, it focuses more on the shepherd provides. So that'll kind of be the theme here that David's working on in these first 4 verses. So we'll begin with Psalm chapter 23, looking at verse 1, and God's word says this: "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." So the first verse here, Coach, introduces a reversal, really, that we see with David, because David had been a shepherd himself, and now he's realizing that God is David's shepherd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's kind of again taking off from what we talked about last week. He says the Lord is really my shepherd now, and as you said, David had been a shepherd since he was a young boy. And he had taken care of sheep, and he has quite a story, from that, in that it was not a really cake easy job, and you see, his brothers were actually away fighting in a war. There was a war with the Philistines, and people might look at David as being afraid, or David of trying to take the easy way out. But, shepherding back then was not like it is now. He said that he had to kill bears, he had to kill lions, and basically what he had with him was his slingshot and his staff. It was about it. So it was a dangerous job, and of course that's not even mentioned the human aspect of it, for enemies that might come and try to steal the sheep. So he had a lot of experience in battle before he ever stepped on the field with Goliath. And of course, that's what he's basically known for, David is here. But he's saying that here, that the Lord being his shepherd means that I lack nothing, because he understands what a shepherd's supposed to provide. Right. And so that's kind of, I think, what he's saying here. All I need, God will provide.
It's really neat, too, Coach, because you think about all of the millions and millions of people that have read or heard this passage over the years and in all these centuries, and especially back at this time. The people that heard this, the people that it was spoken to and written to, could relate to it, because they knew David knew exactly what he was saying. He was a humble shepherd at one point, and that humility we'll talk about here in just a little bit, but these words are some of the most frequently quoted in the entire Bible. And it's very, very familiar to many, many people. But in this verse, David expresses his confidence in God as his shepherd, which is really, really, it would have been a very powerful message back in that era, because David, was the king.
Right.
And so for him to humble himself as a shepherd in this analogy or in this writing, and make God the actual shepherd, that's a loud statement when you think about that. But it's for us today, there's a message here, and that is believers can be sure the Lord, the good shepherd, meets all our needs. Right. Just like David, when he was shepherding, met all the needs of the sheep.
Right.
And we'll talk more about that as we continue on. But in the same way, God does that for us. And he listens to our prayers. And if we call on him, we will receive his grace and help in time of need, as we see here David gets as well. So you look at this idea of the shepherd. It's really a very, very powerful analogy, like we talked about, because you look at what the shepherd's role was between the shepherd and the sheep. And first of all, David, for a person to recognize God as the shepherd and themselves as the sheep, they have to reach a point of humility. They have to allow themselves to be that sheep.
Right.
And when you think about it, it's very remarkable. that the Lord would call himself our shepherd, because it was one of the lowest positions in that era
Right.
that you could have.
Right.
In Israel, in other ancient societies, a shepherd's work was considered the lowest of all works. And matter of fact, it was usually the youngest boy that did it, and it was a very, very dangerous job.
Right. And another thing too about, as I've mentioned here before, growing up from the time I was about 8 years old, I had sheep and took care of sheep on my dad's farm, and I know a little bit about that shepherding and a little bit about sheep. And one of the things I can tell you is, you think about, you hear out west about cattle drives. You don't drive sheep.
No, you lead.
You lead sheep. You get your leading sheep that one of them will follow, and you take them with you, and the sheep follow. You don't drive them, or they scatter everywhere. So it's interesting here that David is making reference to kind of being led by God the shepherd.
Right.
So you got to be willing to be led, first of all, and that's what we find out the kind of man that David is, even though he is king.
Well, before any man or any woman can say, the Lord is my shepherd, they has to first feel themselves as a sheep. Mm-hmm. And you think about what a sheep is, or at least a sheep by nature. Mm-hmm. And for he cannot know that God is his shepherd unless he feels himself that he has the nature of a sheep, at least spiritually. Mm-hmm. And he must relate to a sheep in its foolishness, relate to a sheep in its dependency of the shepherd, and a warped nature that they have. Like you just described. I mean, they're unpredictable.
Yeah, and very, they're not reliable to take care of themselves. A lot of people don't realize this, but if a sheep falls over like in a small ravine or whatever, and have their back is in the ravine, they can't get up.
Yep.
They're stuck. So it sounds more and more like people every time we talk about it, doesn't it?
It really does. But right here in this very first verse, David is making it very clear who his shepherd is, and he's making it very, very clear that because God is my shepherd, I lack nothing.
Right.
Or as the King James Version says, I shall not want.
Right.
It's really a very clear message. You could probably stop on that verse and it be enough, but there's more good to come past that.
Right.
And that takes us to our first question, and that is, how does the Lord provide for our needs and contentment? And David had some good answers for that.
Yeah. First of all, you have to depend on him and quit trying to do everything for yourself. We live in the country, Mike, that is the most blessed country in the entire world.
Yes.
And we are probably the most blessed, but the least content of anybody. We have the most riches, we have the most money, we have the most millionaires, we have the most affluent people, more so than anybody else. And, the thing is, if you don't recognize where that comes from, which I feel that's kind of the direction our country's heading, we've forgotten where all that came from our founding fathers, their belief in God and their trust in God, and they knew where their rights and their abilities came from. And we're kind of losing that now because we're kicking God not only out of our schools and out of our businesses, but we're just about to kick him out of America. Yeah. And we're paying the price right now in a lot of ways. But God provides everything. You can't take your next breath unless God provides it. And people don't. That their answer is, well, there is no God. And that they don't want to be under those kind of constraints, but God provides everything from what we need to live to blessings that we don't deserve or sometimes appreciate. So God has been tremendously good, I know, to you and I, and a lot of people. But as you said, He has to be their shepherd too.
Yeah.
We have to give up our want to be on top and be more content with what we're given. And it's really a terrible thing that people in America have so much, and yet it's not enough. They got to have more. They got to have more things, and that's what it is. More things, more material things, and we're never satisfied. And again, that's what gets people in trouble a lot of times. They're never satisfied with what they got because they're under the impression that the world owes them more,
Yeah.
and so it's not a real good place to be.
Well, in a society of entitlement, which is a society that we live in, Coach, there's a very, very major confusion between the different of needs and wants.
Right.
And really, and Christians should be able to tell the difference. Unfortunately, many Christians fall into this camp
Sure.
of confusing needs and wants. And there are at least 169 verses in the Bible that describes how God provides for us. And none of them say anything about what we want.
Right.
It's what we need
Yeah.
that they talk about. And to put it simply, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 19, it says, "My God will supply all your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus." So while you have prosperity seekers, which you talked about, might always be looking for money and possessions and looking for all these great things, we should take a closer look, really, Coach, at what God desires for us.
Right.
And like any good parent, God will never give us what he knows will harm us.
Right.
I mean, that's the way he is. His intent is to help us develop Christ-likeness. It really, he wants us to be more like Christ, and he's going to provide things that allow us or nudge us along that road. And God does not want us to see him as a heavenly source of mere material possessions.
Right.
That's what a lot of people think. He's this magic genie that you just rub the bottle and poof, you get what you want.
We treat him like a rich grandpa.
Yeah, that's right.
He gives us anything we want. That's what we'd like to think.
Well, acquiring things is not a fundamental goal of this life, and really should not be.
No.
God differentiates between our needs and our wants because he knows where our treasure is and our heart is also. If you really want to know where a man's heart is, just go look at his checkbook.
Right.
It'll reveal it right there. So
Right.
God wants us to know and come to the realization that this world is not our home, nor the riches of this world is not for us permanently.
Right.
And God may bless us in those ways, but he'll do it for his glory. And that's what we have to remember. God provides a way for us to develop an intimate, conversational, obedient relationship with him. That's the purpose of what he blesses us with. Right. And like I said, so much society gets that all confused and all backwards. And unfortunately, many Christians do as well.
Yeah. It's a fine line that we walk sometimes.
It truly is. All right, let's go to verse 2. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. So here we see David writes that the Lord provides rest in green pastures and guides him to still waters.
Yeah, and again, being an old farm boy, and that I can tell you, there's nothing nicer than sitting on a creek bank like I used to do, and watch the water just kind of float by real slowly, and being in a place where you see green pastures in front of you, and it has a very calming effect. And in fact, one of the favorite places that I have in my life is a really high mountain on our farm where I could go up and see for miles. and it was just so majestic that you just forgot your problems, you forgot what was going on in your life, and you were just thankful to be a part of it. And that's what he's saying here. The idea of lie down too. We talked last week about rest. And this is not just physical rest, but it's spiritual rest. And that's one that people have a hard time sometimes realizing that physical rest is different than spiritual rest. Spiritual rest is the one that allows you to get physical rest because you're not anxious, you're not, you're able to sleep soundly, you're not worried about things. And so he's saying here that he's painting a nice picture, but also he's saying, this is how I give you rest in this kind of a setting.
Sheep are fickle creatures. And they're stupid.
In some ways.
They really, truly are. And it's interesting here that that's the analogy being used for us as God's children, as sheep. Shepherd, like you said, shepherds in biblical times, Coach, did not drive the sheep. They led them because they're really not wrapped tight enough to be driven. So the land of Israel did not have plentiful pasture land except really in the rainy season. And you've been there. You know what I'm talking about. So shepherds needed to guide their sheep to green pastures. Otherwise, the sheep would go hungry.
Right.
Now, here's some other interesting facts about sheep. You notice it says, he leads me beside quiet waters. Well, that's really important because David, being a shepherd, knew that running water made sheep nervous. They were not comfortable at all near a rushing stream. It had to be a slow-moving stream, or the sheep would be very restless. Nor will they instinctively seek out clean water. If there is impure water in a stagnant hole somewhere, they'll drink it.
Right. If it's wet, they'll drink it.
They'll drink it. So, therefore, the good shepherd leads his sheep to calm, clean water, much like our good shepherd.
Right.
And you take all this and make it in a spiritual sense. It's exactly what Jesus does for us.
Yeah, and we read in the book of Revelation that when we get to heaven, we're going to see what God calls the river of life, and it is a water that and it's not one. I don't believe it's a rushing water of any type. It's just a smooth, calm river of life that God comes from the throne of God. And you're right about the sheep. They just like I said, they are very, very unpredictable, and they don't seem to understand what's best for them. And that's why they have to be led. They can't be pushed or driven.
But you look at the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep here, Coach. You see that the shepherd knows each one personally.
Right.
And that's the same way that Jesus is with us. You look at this, sheep don't lie down easily and will not unless 4 conditions are met. And you translate this to spiritual rest for us, or spiritual contentment. First of all, they're timid and they don't lie down because they're afraid. So because they are social animals, they will not lie down if there's friction going on amongst the sheep, if they're fighting or jockeying for position on a water hole or whatever. If flies or parasites trouble them, they will not lie down. So there's 3 of them. And the 4th thing is, if sheep are anxious about food or are hungry, they will not lie down. Their physical needs have not been met, so they're restless. And that hints as to why Jesus would meet the physical needs of people before he ever said a word spiritually to them.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting here. Rest comes because the shepherd has dealt with their fear, has dealt with their friction, has dealt with the flies or whatever, and whatever famine they may have.
Right. And we also, Mike, I think don't want to bring out and don't want to forget that one of the parables that Jesus gave was the one concerning a lost sheep. Where the shepherd had 100 sheep, and 99 of them were in the fold, but there was one missing, and he searched and searched and searched for that one sheep, and so every sheep is important to him. And every sheep should be important to us.
Good point. All right, Verse 3. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right path for his name's sake. So David credits the Lord, God, his shepherd, with restoring and refreshing his soul.
Yeah, and key word there, Mike, is soul. Again, this is a spiritual refreshing that we're talking about. You look at people today, Mike, that, as I said, that they should be the most contented people in the world here where we live. But they're the ones, they are so rushed and so busy with their life, going from one place to another, doing this, doing that. They hardly have time for each other. As family, it affects our families, and it always brings about worries because of the things that they're trying. They seem like they're always rushing and don't have time to just relax. And if you think about what we've read here, this is a very relaxing, smooth type of a psalm. That puts you in, like I said, a spirit of relaxation. Yep. And that's what God can do. And that's what he's trying to get to David's saying here. He says, he refreshes my soul. And like I said, the things that makes the soul, weep are things like worry and anxiety and the things that we have to go through a lot of times because we're so uncontent. There is no content, and that way our soul doesn't get any rest. And then the other thing we see is the shepherd guides. A lot of Israel is hilly, and when they took the took the sheep to other pastures, oftentimes they would have to travel over some very narrow paths over the mountains that were dangerous. So, the shepherd would always take them the best way that they could to get from one pasture to another. And God does that the same thing with us. He takes us over as smooth as we can. But again, that doesn't mean we don't have any problems. But as far as if we can get to the point that David is, our soul will be at rest. We may still be, anxious about some things, but that's our fault, because we're not letting God really take control the way that David's talking about here. So, there's just so much that when you read this psalm, as a little story I said at the beginning, you can see why people just start weeping when they hear this, because they would love to be that, but they can't.
Yeah, some people, when they hear this, a lot of times you hear this at a funeral. And the funerals that I have done, I always use Psalm 23 at the graveside. And people weep immediately because they all know what encouragement Psalm 23 offers from God himself.
Right.
And it really gives them some seriousness to what's happening, that their loved one is gone, but God has provided, rest for their soul, which we'll talk a little more about. But in Bible times, sheep became injured too.
Oh, yeah.
And like what you're talking about, they traveled over rough terrain a lot of times where animals would try to get them, and they would escape. So it was the shepherd's job to treat those wounds and to heal, to get them to where they healed and restore them back to good health. So how often does God do that for us? I mean, how often do we have illnesses or health issues and we're hurting physically, and God restores our health for us? And you think about the way sheep traveled through the countryside. You look at that, there were well-worn paths. But the well-worn paths, let me get a drink here real quick. That was the easiest way for the sheep to travel. Right. But sometimes they would get off the beaten path and get lost, like what you were talking about. And it refers back to the parable that Jesus spoke of 100 sheep, and if one got lost, he would leave the 99 and charge, somebody else to take care of them, and he would go search for the one. How encouraging is that as to how precious and how special each one of us are? Because many times we're like that sheep.
Yeah.
We get off the beaten path, and we kind of stray away from God, just like the sheep strays away from the shepherd, and yet he still comes after us.
Yeah.
That should be encouraging to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right, let's go to verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So David could walk through a dark ravine, perhaps even death, fearlessly because God was with him.
Yeah, there's some verses in the Bible that I think that it's only captured correctly by the King James Version.
That's true.
This is one of them.
It is.
Because even though I walk through the darkest valley, now David is very clear. He says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Right.
Yeah, you see, we need to understand that David was not, he was king, but read his story. A lot of his life, he was running for his own life. King Saul tried to kill him. King Saul sent his enemies after David to try to kill him. His own family tried to disown him and get him dethroned. So David was in danger most of his life, from the time he was a shepherd boy until his death. So he's to the point where now that he's trying to say that he's been in this shadow of death for so long, he just puts it all in God's hands and goes on because he knows God will take care of him. But this is the verse that a lot of people remember the most, as you say, when you give it like as a eulogy at a funeral. And I think this is the verse that gets them thinking.
Oh yeah,
individually.
Yeah,
and they start thinking, wow, it's we all have that idea of death out there. We know it's out there somewhere, and the more we're reminded of that, the more we should be thinking that that's the one thing I have no control over, or at least they think that. And that's where hopefully they start realizing that there is a way through that, but they have to go through Christ to do that. And so a lot of people that this really makes them think, and that's why it is a good psalm to read at a place where they've lost a loved one.
Yeah, and you look at this too, Coach, and he talks about through the darkest valley, or it's a shadow of death here that he's talking to, and that's a real issue for everybody.
Sure.
Because a smart, wise person once told me nobody gets out alive. Death is something everybody gets to experience.
Yeah.
And it's not talking about death itself here. It's talking about the shadow of death.
Yeah, right. Because it's that shadow comes over us, long before we ever maybe get to that point.
But here we see David camped out in a really encouraging spot here, because even though that shadow is upon him, and we don't know what that looks like here, he's still, God is my shepherd, I shall not want. I mean, you can recite it over and over again, and we see here how encouraging is that for us, because we should not fear when the shadow of death is upon us, because Jesus has conquered the grave. So death is not something we should fear.
Right.
It's already conquered. Now, the shadow of death might be painful. It might be tough. I've said this to you many times. I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Yeah, right.
But once that occurs, God's got all that handled.
Yeah, and death becomes, instead of something to fear, it becomes something to look forward to, as far as, it's a new door that opens into a whole new life for the Christian. And it's a life that is much better than the one that we see here. That's why we say things about people that loved ones we've lost that suffered during the time they were here. And it's easy to say then, well, they are much better off now than they were.
Yeah.
And that's what, again, this is all tied into what David's saying here.
Many scholars, too, Coach, and looking at this verse, it says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's interesting, because some scholars believe that those were two different things. Some scholars believe it was one and the same. Well, a rod really was a very thick stick that they kept on their belt, that they could, beat an animal with if they needed to, or defend themselves, or defend their sheep. and the staff actually had a hook on it,
Right.
and they could actually guide the sheep with it. And that's why when David says, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me," that's because he knows that they're for his protection and his guiding.
Right.
So David's really in a spiritually mature place right here.
Yeah.
And that takes us to our second question here, and that is it easier for us to follow God in times of goodness or hardship? Good luck.
Well, that answer's easy. Obviously, for us, it's easier to follow in times of goodness because, we feel like everything's rosy and, why do we need God? Everything's going well. And we only have, for many people, it's, I'll call on God when I need him, and we get to that point where we feel like that we've kind of got life by the tail a little bit. We seem to have control of what's going on. And so the good times, we just kind of put God up on the shelf many times, or as we talk about using him as a spare tire sometimes when we get into trouble. But, it's much easier to follow God in the good times. And we seem like when the bad times do hit, it seems for a lot of people, God's the last place they go. After they try everything else and there's nothing left, they think of God then as that spare tire, and they'll go get him. But and that just shows a sign of an immature Christian, or people that are immature with their faith. Because when you need God the most, he's there, but you got to have that faith, and that's what they don't have.
This is a loaded question.
Yeah.
Because you can really think through this and argue both sides of this. But when you look at it, obviously, yes, it is easier to follow God in the good times. Unfortunately, many Christians don't do that. Many Christians become content, and they take God for granted in those good times instead of realizing what the source of those good times are.
Right.
And then when the troubled times arrive, it's like God is like this break glass in case of an emergency thing.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they want to pray more, be in tune with God more. So it's really tough answering that for those reasons. Obviously, the easiest answer is yes, it's easier to follow God in good times, but the most effective time is when we're having hard times.
Yeah.
All right, and that takes us to the next set of verses here, and we see verses 5 and 6, and it's going to talk about the shepherd king. And this is really, really neat as this unfolds. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Now, this is an interesting analogy here because it really describes a gracious host that there may have been back in those days for an honored guest. This is how they would have been treated.
Right, and the other thing too, when the way he says it here in the beginning, the shepherd is preparing a table before him in the presence of his enemies. Now, you look at that from a standpoint of a soldier, that speaks of this soldier being so sure that the battle's going to go his way, that in the midst of all the stuff going on, he can take time to go attend a calm, easy, nice provided dinner, so it's like he understands that God's got it all under control, and God's providing him meals, like almost a banquet he's describing here. So it's like even in the midst of the most terrible times you can have, God can make you feel like there's hope there, no matter what enemy you're fighting, no matter what's is the problem. But he makes you feel like that things are going to be okay one of these days, because God still has the final say in what's going on. And then he talks about anointing his head with oil. Well, this was a process that they would do after somebody had walked on the dusty roads of Israel, and it was like. Sometimes we'll splash water in our face or something. Well, they anointed with oil, with olive oil and different spices and things all over the person's head, and it was from what I understand, very very refreshing, and it was like getting cleaned up a little bit, and you felt much better after that happened. So, and obviously you would do that before you ate. This is kind of the cleaning before you eat. So. All this speaks of, like I said, a banquet, but one that's in the middle of you would think anyone would even dare try to have a banquet in the middle of a war.
Right.
And that's kind of where he's coming from here, I believe.
Well, and once again, David is speaking in terms that his listeners and readers can relate to.
Uh-huh.
And we can as well, because when you look at this and it says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, you think about what a shepherd does. Mm-hmm. A shepherd is out in the wilderness with his sheep, mm-hmm. and there may be animals around trying to get to these sheep, sure. But yet the sheep don't even realize that there's trouble, right. Because the shepherd is taking care of the trouble. Right. That's the same thing that happens when we look to God as our shepherd.
Right.
And he also keeps them fed. He keeps food right there in the presence of the dangers that they deal with, so their physical needs are being met and their safety is being provided for. Yeah. And that's what's happening here with David. Yeah. When he said, not only that, but he's treating me like a banquet guest here. Right. So and here's a really good question. I saw this question. David's in a real good place of contentment here with life. And the scholar Charles Spurgeon said this, "Beloved, I will ask you now a question. How would it be with you if God had filled your cup in portion to your faith?"
Yeah.
How much would you have had in your cup? Mm-hmm. And when you think about that, if God were to fill our cup according to our faith, all of us need to really take note of that question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and that last part of what it says there, we don't want to short that. The last part says, "My cup overflows." Right. When God provides, He doesn't just provide a little bit to get by. If you are in His will, if you're trying to follow God, His blessings are ones like the Bible talks quite often about an overflowing of blessings and things, and abundance is a word that we read a lot about in the Bible. And God is not stingy with what He gives us. He does not give us a little bit. If now sometimes because of our actions and our sins, we hurt ourselves and don't get the full amount,
like David did.
Exactly. And but God's intent is to not just bless us as a little bit, like the shepherd looking for food for the sheep. He blesses beyond means, and the best way to describe it is, the cup overflows with blessing. So who wouldn't want that from God?
Right. Yep. All right, let's go to our last verse here today, Coach, verse 6. "Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So David expresses his conviction here, Coach, in this verse, that the Lord's goodness will be with him throughout all life. And he's just not talking about life on this side of heaven.
Right. Yeah. This is a verse that deals with eternity.
Yes.
And it's not, as you said, not just while we're here on earth, but it continues into eternity. And he says, "Surely goodness and love." There's several times in the Bible those two words are hooked together: goodness and love,
like business partners, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what God is. He's full of goodness and love. And interestingly, the way he puts it, that goodness and love are following him. We usually think of the devil trying to get to us, following us, but God, the good things he's talking about seem to happen to him, even though he's had a rough life, but he's willing to consider that as he knows he's nearing the end of his life. I think this is toward the end of his life, and he realizes that this goodness and this love is still through all the times God's carried him through. And now that he's toward the end, he knows it's not going to end. and it's just going to get better. And then, of course, the last thing he says is, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." You can only make that statement if you are a Christian or if you have God in your life and in your heart. That's the only, you can't make that statement otherwise. And because God will not let you go to heaven just because he likes you. You have to be a committed follower of God and of Christ and what he did. But that's what's left. As we get close to the end of our life, we need to really start realizing that our hope is in the future. It's not still, what we have left of our life. That's just an open door that opens up to the beginning of the rest of eternity, for the rest of time. And we can't even imagine what it's going to be like. Nobody can imagine all the things that's going to happen there. And everything, as good as we've had it here, it's only going to be better.
Yeah.
But again, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We're actually going to be able to be with God. And to me, that's just an amazing thing, that the creator of the universe, the creator of everything, is going to be able to, I'm going to be able to see him, talk to him, walk with him perhaps, who knows? And it's going to be in a place and a time where there's no evil of any kind, no sins. It's going to be a perfect utopia type thing, Garden of Eden again. And so, that's where your hope comes from. But those that don't have him, now that's not where you're heading, So that's, again, that's the other side of it.
Talking about the house of the Lord, I've heard it put this way before. It's two chambers. There's a lower chamber and an upper chamber, and they refer to this world as the lower chamber, and then you pass on to the upper chamber. So while we're here, and this is the way David really looked at this, he looked at this whole world as the lower chamber of God's, I will dwell in God's house forever.
Right.
That was the lower chamber, and of course he would pass on to the upper chamber when he passed and when he died. But you look at this verse, and in the King James, like you were referring to, it actually uses the word goodness and mercy, not goodness and love. It's kind of the same meaning, but mercy is a little bit more definitive when you talk about it. And these are like twin guardian angels that are following along behind here. So it's kind of interesting when you look at that. So the psalm ends with the calmest assurance that we would enjoy the presence of the Lord forever, both in his days on this earth and beyond. Right. Those days referring to what David had.
Right.
And that takes us to our final question here today, and that is, how should the promise of heaven change the way we handle and look at hardships on earth? That's an easy one.
Yeah, because if we really believe that's where we're headed, then we understand that moving from this world is an upgrade, a great upgrade. So, if you have a terrible disease, a lot of times, there's a lot of pain. Sometimes it comes with those diseases. And, you go through hard time, with your money, with just everything that you've depended on up to this point suddenly can be taken away from you, and you just spend your time in a nursing home or spend your time, unfortunately, with having somebody have to take care of you because you can't do that. That's not a whole great life to look forward to. Yeah. It's no wonder that people look beyond that to when they pass on, knowing that what's on the other side of that door is more like what they would just hope and pray for in their life. So, that's how you can overlook the hardships that you have to go through here on earth. It all has to come down to the hope that we have, and the restoration that our soul has from God by being in a place, getting as close to a place like David was as that we can. then we have that hope for future, even though it may mean that we're not in this life anymore.
Yeah. When God's children, Coach, place their focus on heaven, it really motivates us to live pure lives,
Right.
to live more pure lives. And focusing on heaven places suffering in perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to do, especially if you're the one that's suffering.
Right.
And you and I both have known, a lot of people that fall into that category. And you and I both have had the question asked of us is, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Yeah. And, 2 Corinthians 4:17-18 really puts that in perspective if anybody wants to read that and see what that answer is. But whatever problem people are having, whatever it is, physical, mental, spiritual, whatever it is, it's real. And it's heavy to them.
Sure.
And everybody needs to take a step back and realize that in that way. But the Bible says that compared to the weight of the blessing God has planned for us in eternity, it is light.
Yeah.
Focusing on heaven does not eliminate suffering, but it does put that suffering in the proper perspective.
Right. And it kind of ended up like this, as I've heard people say, the worst day of heaven in heaven is better than the best day here on earth.
By far.
Yeah.
By far. Yeah. And that takes us to our thought to remember, and that is this. God has provided, is providing, and will provide, Coach. And could you take that thought to remember and give us some final thoughts as we wrap it up here today?
Well, I think the idea that I kind of left this after studying this psalm was again, going back to the word we first talked about at the beginning, and that's the idea of contentment. We're going to be here on earth for a while. Now, why not be the most contented as you can be? And because many of the problems that we have are caused by our discontent. And so here's some kind of conclusions that I came up with along those lines. How do you become content? Well, first and foremost, the first step to contentment is to make the Lord your shepherd.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second step to contentment is to know and enjoy his provisions for you. He's always going to provide for you, and enjoy what you're given. We overlook blessings that he gives us every day because we're tied up with other things in the world. Third thing, contentment is to always walk with the good shepherd through every type of hardship you come up. Don't forget that he's not going to be away from you. The one thing that David is really sure of is God is right there with him. And that's the way we need to do too. Even through the hardest times, God is going to be with you. And the last thing is simply to look for God's goodness in all situations. And again, sometimes they're hard to find, but God will help you find those things if you look for and turn to him. So I think those are some things to think about becoming content while we're still here. And really good advice. Yeah, we won't have any trouble being content once we leave here.
No, not at all. So that's Psalm 23.
Yeah.
And we began this entire segment with, when was the last time you heard Psalm 23? What context did you hear it in? Were you at a funeral? Were you being encouraged? Well, hopefully after today's segment, you look at Psalm 23 maybe a little differently. And maybe it's even more encouraging to you than it was prior to sitting in with Coach and I this week. And if you have any questions about that, we would love to hear from you. This is Pine Grove Baptist Church in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and you should see the contact information on the screen. If you have any questions about anything, we would love to hear from you. From those of you who watch week to week, maybe this is your very first time. We would encourage you to share this message out on Facebook or whatever social media platform it is that you subscribe to with all your friends and contacts. It just gets the word out. And we thank each one of you for watching week to week, and we don't take it for granted, and we do see it as a very, very dear privilege. Next week, the title of our study is Songs of Praise, and we're going to continue in the book of Psalm next week with Psalm 146. So until next time, this is Mike Cornell, along with Coach Ron Lathey and our production team, Andy and Courtney Holbrook, wishing everybody have a blessed week, and we hope to see you real soon.